Now, continue on looking at hormones. So we've talked about different types of hormones. So we have the amino acid base, which is going to be whether it's polypeptide or peptides. Um, these are all going to be, amino acid is going to be water soluble, meaning that they cannot enter the cells. So they can't go in. Remember again from AMP1, we have the phospholipid bilayer. Most things that are water soluble have to have some sort of channel or some way to go past it. So since these polypeptides or peptide amino acid based hormones, they can't go into the plasma membrane through it. So they have to have receptors on the outside of the cell that will come in so they can have their effect. And this has to do, so when we talked about upregulation and downregulation, it can be either um, receptors on the plasma membrane, but it can also be receptors inside the cell. So we have receptors either way. So any receptor with the hormone doesn't have to be um, either inside or outside or on the surface of the cell. Steroids, again, are from cholesterol, so they are going to be lipid soluble, meaning they dissolve in fat, so they can get along with fat. Remember, oil and water don't mix, but oil and oil or water and water mix. So we have the plasma membrane again, and you have the steroid. It can just travel right through and hang out with the fatty acid tails and go into the cells. So they can go intracellular or inside the cell. So you can imagine these are going to have receptors on the surface, on the plasma membrane. These guys, the steroids, are going to have intracellular receptors. So they can go inside and have the receptors in the cytoplasm. So again, lipid-soluble hormones bind to receptors that are inside the target cells, so they can go intracellular. Water-soluble hormones, again, are on receptors on the plasma membrane. What they have to do is they have their receptor on the plasma membrane, and then they have a second messenger. So for whatever reason, they change the shape of a protein or have a second messenger that's inside the cell or intracellular that then can have its effect inside the cell. So it's kind of like you call someone and then they have the action instead of just walking inside their door to have the action kind of inside the cell. And it can have what we call amplification of a small signal, meaning you can have a bunch of these second messengers activated and have the activity go on inside the cell. So this is going to have a major kind of way of communicating. One hormone molecule can have a lot of response that's happening inside the cell. So you can think about a text a bunch of people. So you text 5 people, well, you're getting the signal out to more people than if you were going to text one person and then they text the next person and then next. So it just takes longer. No matter whether it's water soluble or lipid soluble, the response of the target cells depend first on the hormone concentration. So how much hormone do you have? Also, the amount of target cell receptors. So again, this is going to be the downregulation and upregulation. So you're going to have a different effect based on how many receptors you have. And the last thing is other hormones can have an impact. So we're going to talk about how there's some hormones that are antagonistic, meaning they kind of oppose each other's actions. Some help each other. So we can look at kind of the response of other hormones can determine kind of each other. So it just depends on each other. Again, water-soluble hormones, the receptors on the plasma membrane, The hormone itself is the first messenger, and then it has a message, it sends it to the intracellular second messenger. The second messenger usually is going to have an effect on an enzyme because remember, enzymes are those catalysts for reactions that are unchanged. So all of these chemical reactions that are happening in the cells are depending on enzymes. So if you want to change a chemical reaction, whether you want to break things down or build things up, you're going to have an impact on an enzyme. So that's going to change your metabolic reactions. So these are going to have an effect on the cell. Again, you're going to be building things, you're going to be breaking things down depending on what protein or what hormone is going on. Examples of these are examples of a secondary messenger. Cyclic AMP and calcium ions are examples of second messengers that are intracellular that can help communicate what the hormone wants the cell to do. Also, there's usually a G protein. So this is going to be where the G protein changes shape, has kind of allows release of cyclic AMP, which is your secondary messenger. So usually a G protein is involved in communicating the message of this water soluble hormone inside the cell. So this is just looking at, don't need to memorize all of this. So I'm just kind of looking at the difference. So again, the hormone is on a receptor on the surface of the cell. You activate a G protein and it causes the secondary messenger to be made, which is in this example, cyclic AMP. And you might have open ion channels. I didn't mention that. So sometimes you can open certain channels to change what's going on inside the cell, or you can activate enzymes. Some way you're changing the cell and changing the way it works. And that's an activating hormone. We can also have a protein that antagonizes this, where you have cyclic AMP that is broken down to AMP that actually reduces enzyme activity. So you can either increase enzyme activity or you can decrease. So hormones aren't always ones that are just going to turn on enzymes. They might want to turn off enzymes. So they'll have an inhibitory effect on the cell, or they can have a more excitatory effect on the cell. This is just showing you calcium still have a G protein, but then the secondary messenger is going to be calcium. Usually it has to bind to an intracellular protein called calmodulin, and you have opening of the calcium channels, so you get more calcium inside the cell. But the point is a hormone that is water soluble binds to the protein on the plasma membrane and then can have an effect with a secondary messenger. Steroid hormones, again, can go into the cell because they're lipid soluble. They can go past the plasma membrane with those fatty acid tails. So their receptors are intracellular inside because they can go inside. They more often have activity in reading or kind of turning on or turning off specific genes. So they can go either into the cytoplasm or even directly into the nucleus because they can go through the nuclear membrane. And so they're more often going to change protein synthesis. So what they can do is if you want a chemical reaction, instead of turning on or turning off enzymes, they can have more enzymes made or less enzymes made. They can also increase the production of structural proteins. So they can change the structure of the cell. So they're more focusing on actually changing protein synthesis at the level of the genes versus turning on or turning off enzymes when we looked at water soluble. And it's just because they can go inside the cell and then they can have their direct effects that way. So they alter genes directly themselves, which genes all are your blueprint of all the proteins that need to be made in your body. So you change, you turn on or turn off a gene, then you're going to turn on or turn off specific protein synthesis. Thyroid hormones are going to be different in that they are amino acid based, but they can go into the cell because they have a carrier to it. So remember, carrier mediated. So there's a carrier that they can go inside the cell. So even though they're water soluble because they're amino acid based, they go inside the cell. So they're the weird ones that don't have a receptor on the outside of the cell, they have intracellular receptors. And specifically, they go to receptors on the mitochondria. Now, remember, the mitochondria produce ATP. So, if you want to have an effect on the energy level of the cell, go to the mitochondria. So, what they do is they bind to receptors on the mitochondria and increase ATP production. So, this is increased energy production. They can also go inside the nucleus. So they go through the nuclear membrane and they go inside the nucleus and do what lipid soluble or steroids. So they actually kind of do both weirdly. So they increase energy production. So you're going to turn on kind of making ATP and all involved in that. I'm not going into specifics of that, or they can bind to the receptor in the nucleus and they can turn on genes or change the rate of protein synthesis. That should be synthesis. So what they can do is they can do what steroid hormones do as well. Because they're intracellular, they have a direct effect on protein synthesis by going to the nucleus. So this is just looking specifically at a steroid hormone. So they can just diffuse, go through the plasma membrane. They'll find the receptor that's intracellular. And a lot of times, even that receptor, it can either go intracellular or they can directly go inside the cell where the receptor is. So this complex of receptor and hormone can go into the nucleus and have its effect, or the receptor could already be in the nucleus and the hormone could go and have its effect. They then can bind to DNA, to your genes, and either activate or inactivate. This is showing you activation. So they activate the gene and you produce messenger RNA, and messenger RNA then goes out into the cell to the ribosomes and you make a protein. So you have a response that way. So this is kind of similar that you're having the end results, but you're changing protein synthesis where you're making enzymes or um, kind of to change the chemical reaction that's happening inside the cell. So a little bit different based on whether it's steroid or water soluble. Just looking at hormones interactions, because remember, there's tons of hormones. We don't talk about them all. We're going to talk about the major ones, but we have hormones that'll interact with each other. And there are different terms on how these hormones are reacting together. So, permissiveness, you can think of giving permission. So, this means one hormone needs permission to work without the other hormone. So, it needs both hormones to be around to have its work together. So, without one, the other one's lost. And this comes into play for an example of thyroid and sex hormones. So, things like testosterone have to have thyroid around to properly work. Without thyroid levels, then your testosterone actually becomes abnormal and cannot work. So, thyroid is actually important in those sex hormone levels. Without thyroid saying, okay, you can do your job, testosterone will not be able to work properly. Synergism is working together. So this is going to be where they have the same effect. This means if they're having the same effect, then you cause what we call amplification. So if one hormone has this kind of increase in something, and you have another hormone that does the same thing, well, now you've doubled your effect. So you don't need to increase kind of the level of just one hormone or the other. You can just release both and you can actually have the same effect. So it's called amplification, meaning you're increasing the same effect and making it more exaggerated. An example of those is glucagon and epinephrine. Now, epinephrine, remember, is your sympathetic. So we talked about it with the sympathetic nervous system, so your fight or flight. This is going to cause the liver to release sugar or glucose, which can be used for energy. Glucagon is the hormone that we talk about that's going to cause, that's the point of it is to release glucose. So glucagon, gluca is the glucose. The point of glucagon is to increase your blood sugar or your glucose. Without glucagon, so this is why you don't have to eat. You can wait 24 hours and not eat because glucagon will maintain your blood sugar at a level that you need. So if you release glucagon and epinephrine at the same time, they're both causing the liver to release glucose. So your blood sugar might go from 100 to 120 with glucagon, but with them both around, it might go to 200. So you're having an increased effect because they both do the same thing, having kind of the same reaction. Obviously, epinephrine does other things and glucagon does too, but in general, if you're releasing both, you're going to have an increased effect. So if you need a lot of energy all of a sudden, like you need to run from something, and your muscles are going to be working a lot and you need a lot of ATP and that comes from glucose, then this is why the hormones are going to be released together. Antagonism is going to be where you antagonize or you have the opposite effect. So these are going to be working against each other. So you can think against each other, working against. This is where they are opposite reaction. One goes up, one goes down. So glucagon is going to be the other example where your blood glucose is increased by glucagon. So your blood glucose goes up. Insulin actually causes blood glucose to go into the cells. So they're into the cells, they're not in the bloodstream anymore. Blood glucose is not circulating, it's in the cells. So this causes blood glucose to decrease because it's not in blood anymore. It's inside the cells. You can't measure it. So they oppose each other. Glucagon increases blood glucose, insulin decreases. So they work against each other. Another thing that we have, kind of the why hormones are released. Again, most are controlled by negative feedback systems. And remember, this isn't negative meaning bad. This is just going back to normal. So just using kind of you eat something, and again, your blood glucose is going to go up. Well, insulin, and we'll talk about insulin more later, is going to push glucose into the cells so they can be used for energy. And so then it causes blood glucose to go back to normal. So normal blood glucose is around 100. So depending. So insulin, say you eat and it goes up to 170, insulin's released, you go back to the 100. So you go back to normal. So negative feedback. And it can be the same. If your blood glucose drops to 60, you're going to release glucagon, which will increase your blood glucose, and you'll go back to 100. So it's all going backward, back to your set point, and that's negative feedback. So the reasons why hormones are going to be released. Now, humoral and hormonal. Make sure you can understand those differences and read the word carefully. Humoral stimuli is going to be because of ions and nutrients. So things like your calcium, things like your sodium, things like glucose, like I just talked about. Those are going to cause changes in levels of those. So calcium levels we talked about with AMP1 with parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. Calcium levels change, you release a hormone in response to that. Same with sodium, changes, you're going to release a hormone. You're going to release a hormone based on glucose. The second reason why a hormone's going to be released is because of neural stimuli. So neural means nerves. So this is because of the nervous system and it causes a hormone release. So it's coordination between the nervous system and hormones. The sympathetic nervous system is going to have a direct connection to the inside of the adrenal gland, and we'll talk about these more, that are going to secrete catecholamines. This is going to be your epinephrine and your norepinephrine mainly. So norepinephrine and epinephrine are going to be, again, neurotransmitters, but they can work as hormones that are going to be part of your sympathetic nervous system or your fight or flight. And we'll talk about those more later, but they're in direct response because of your sympathetic nervous system. Hormonal stimuli is going to be most often kind of a lot of the ones we're talking about is going to be because hormones stimulate other hormones to be released. So we're going to talk about the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary hormones. So the hypothalamus is going to release what we call releasing hormones. And they're going to go right, kind of direct connection to the anterior pituitary. So you go to the anterior pituitary, and then the anterior pituitary is going to release usually stimulating hormones often, or some sort of other hormone. So the releasing hormones from the hypothalamus cause the stimulating hormones from the anterior pituitary to be released. And then even the anterior pituitary can go to things like the thyroid and have its release of its hormones. So it's kind of cascade where hormone causes hormone causes hormone. And that's hormonal stimuli.